Shane, I think, is George Stevens' masterpiece. I think it's a great movie. It's often referred to as as a Western for people who don't like Westerns. I think this is unfair. I love Westerns, and I think this is a great Western, but fundamentally a great film. And a really important film for Stevens, who had a very unusual career in Hollywood, I think, in some regards. His early training was in comedy. He worked for Hal Roach. He photographed numerous Laurel and Hardy comedies. When he started making feature films, a lot of them were quite light-hearted, you know, making films with Wheeler and Woolsey. Made a couple of musicals with Fred Astaire, Swing Time and Damsel in Distress. Gunga Din, a great adventure film. The James Stewart, Ginger Rogers comedy Vivacious Lady. And then in the early 40s, he made 4 films, I think, which were very highly rated. Penny Serenade, which is a more serious film with Cary Grant and Irene Dunne. A brilliant comedy thriller, Talk of the Town. Woman of the Year, which was the first time that Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn appeared together, and The More the Merrier. But then what happened was that Stevens became a photographer for the war, for the Allies in the war. And, you know, along with contemporaries like John Ford and William Wyler and John Huston, etc. And he was part of the liberating force that liberated Dachau. And it had a profound impact on his sensibility. Wyler said of him, you know, that George Stevens, and it's an interesting way of phrasing it, is not the same man, he said, after seeing the corpses at Dachau. And for a time after the war, he wondered actually whether he could go back to directing films. But after the war, the films that he made were quite a variety, but much more serious than the films that he'd made before his war experience. Films that were full of tragedy and sacrifice, you know, Place in the Sun, Shane, I think, Giant, Diary of Anne Frank, greatest story ever told. And the big critical debate about Stevens' career, I think, is whether he exchanged the delight of the comedies and became more pompous, and his films became heavier and more laboured, or whether it's almost like David Lean in a way, or whether the later stage of his career is the real sort of core of his achievement. I tend to think the latter, and I think his great achievement, at the core of his achievement, are 3 films that he made that were quite imaginative and unusual, sort of inquisitions in a way, or examinations of America and the meaning of America and the opportunities of America and America's definition of itself. And he made a Place in the Sun, Shane, and then Giant. Now Shane, when it first appeared in 1953, was immediately acclaimed as one of the greatest westerns ever. And it was nominated for 6 Oscars, I think, and won for its colour photography. George Stevens that year got the prestigious Irving G. Thalberg Memorial Award. But a reaction sort of set in against the film fairly soon after, and to this day I think its critical reputation is not as high as it should be. There were 2 particularly influential essays that disputed Shane's greatness. One was by the cultural commentator Robert Warshaw, an essay called The Westerner, in which he thought Shane represented a rather negative development in the West, and he thought it represented what he called its aestheticizing tendency, and that he was trying to freeze the Western myth, and that he thought the film was rather pompous as a result. I think actually, if by aestheticizing tendency he means that Stevens was trying to make as artistically fulfilling a film as possible, I think in that sense he was quite right, and I think actually Stevens succeeded. André Bazin then wrote the Evolution of the Western, his essay, which appeared in the same year as the Warshaw, and he didn't like Shane either. And his phrase was that in Shane, Stevens set out to justify the Western with a Western. You know, that he set out almost with a deliberate desire to elevate it to a more serious level, kind of thing. I think this is completely mistaken. Stevens set out to make a George Stevens movie that just happened to be a Western, and it contained a lot of ingredients of the traditional Western. You know, you've got the gunfight, you've got the saloon brawl, you've got the funeral, you've got the final showdown, the farewell. There are a lot of ingredients in there of the classical Western that Stevens, I think, does as well in this film as they've ever been done. But typically for him, I think there are other elements as well that fascinated him, of equal importance. Shane, the character, is an outsider. He was fascinated by outsiders. A lot of his characters are, from Alice Adams, the Montgomery Clift hero in Place in the Sun, of people who come into a society who don't really belong to that society and try to assimilate and fail. Another theme, I think, which is very powerful in Shane, in the film of Shane, is the role of the woman in a man's society. And this has to do with the role that G. Arthur plays in the film. Now, that was a very strong theme in Stevens' films in the 1930s, you know, in Alice Adams, in Annie Oakley, in Vigil in the Night, in Quality Street, culminating, I think, in Woman of the Year. And it returns, I think, in Shane. But I think the thing that he always said about Shane is that, and it's a funny thing to say in a way, I think, but he said, it's really my war movie, Shane. He said, Wyler made his war movie and Huston did his and Ford done his. Shane is mine. And what he meant by that, I think, there's something about the narrative that follows almost a kind of classical war narrative, you know, a dispute over territory, a tyrant trying to take over, intimidation, attempts at conciliation, attempts at compromise, but it gets more and more, but it escalates, it gets more and more violent. Finally, you get to the point of no return where force can only be met by force. So I think that intrigued him. But the main thing he wanted to show, he said, was the effect of somebody being shot. He said, if there's one thing more than any other thing about Shane that made me want to do it, is that if you fire a .45 gun at somebody, you reduce a figure instantly from the vertical to the horizontal. He was tired, he said, of seeing westerns that didn't do that, and he was disturbed by seeing children playing at cowboys that didn't do that. He wanted to show what violence really was, and of course that particular motif comes in that great and terrifying scene when Jack Palance's gunfighter, Wilson, goads Elisha Cook Jr. as Torry into this completely unequal gunfight that we know Torry is going to lose. And Stevens took great care of the sound of the gunshots in the film. He said, you know, a gun isn't bravado in my film, it's death. And he had these mini cannons firing into barrels, you know, and augmenting them with rifle shot, so that when a gun goes off, you jump out of your skin. The cast, I think, is wonderful. Alan Ladd, I think, I think he's absolutely perfect as Shane. And I think the fact that Ladd is a screen actor that is of a somewhat different kind from, you know, Van Heflin and Jean Arthur and the others in the film, suits the film really, because it puts Shane, the character, in a slightly different realm to the other. He's got a slightly, you know, he comes from a different world kind of thing into this environment. It would have been a very different film. I think Philip French said this. It would have been a very different film if you had either sort of Gary Cooper or James Stewart or John Wayne as Shane. Somehow Ladd gives it a different quality. And as I say, he plays the scene with the boy, Brandon de Wilde, extremely well. Brandon de Wilde, I think, was the only one who was considered for that role. He was actually, although I think he was only sort of 9 or 10 when he did it, and I think he was the youngest person at that time ever to be nominated for an Oscar for a performance. But he was quite an experienced stage actor by that time. He'd been on stage in Member of the Wedding, the stage version of the Carson McCullers novel, and was in Fred Zinnemann's film version of it. So he'd got Brandon de Wilde. Van Heflin, ideal really. Heflin, never a leading man, always to be relied on, and a good solid performance of a you know, a realistic individual, I think. I know Fred Zinnemann once told me that he liked working with Heflin. He said because he didn't take acting too seriously, you know, so he'd just come in and do his job and then do it. But he's very good, I think, in roles like that, and he's going to play a similar role in, you know, another classic Western, 3:10 to Yuma. Jean Arthur is very interesting in this, because Shane was her first film for 5 years, and it turned out to be her last film. She'd had a bad time with Billy Wilder on A Foreign Affair, because she thought he was sabotaging her performance almost, and giving too much favour towards Marlene Dietrich. Wilder, you know, strenuously denied this and just, you know, pointed out, actually, you're playing a sort of uptight Republican congresswoman. It's part of your role. But she told Charles Brackett, you know, that if something isn't done about this, I'm going to retire from the screen. And he didn't take her seriously, but in fact she did. And she came back because she'd worked with Stevens before on a couple of films, very happily, on Talk of the Town and The More the Merrier. And interestingly, in relation to what I was saying before about, you know, the war experience and the impact of Dachau on him, she said he was a completely different person, very serious, no jokes, but typically very painstaking. And she said he wanted me to play Marion Starrett as someone who is rather tired, a rather faded figure, she said, which I found very difficult, she said. But I think it's interesting in relation to the character, because one of the things that intrigues Stevens about the material is that it operates on more than one level. It's often presented, as classic Western, Shane equals good, Wilson equals evil kind of thing, face off at the end. There's far more going on in it than that. Stevens took a long time shooting his films, but because he wanted to have as many options as possible when he was editing to choose from, but also because I think there are a lot of things going on in the scenes that he wants to bring out. And one of the subtexts of Shane, I think, is Marion Starrett's growing affection for Shane and her growing dissatisfaction, I think, with her life. And as well as being a mystery about where Shane comes from, I always think it's quite intriguing to think, where did Joe and Marion meet? You get the impression that she's married beneath her in a way, that she had a different kind of idea for her own future, and just occasionally Joe's clumsiness, social clumsiness, irks her. I actually think Shane is a brilliant screen adaptation of the novel. Some of the changes it makes are quite minor, but they're very significant. There's a scene when the homesteaders are having the meeting.
Joey? Yes? Don't get to liking Shane too much.
In the novel, the father says that to Joey. In the film, Marion says it, and she's being protective of her son's feelings, fair enough. She might also be being a bit worried by Joey's growing adulation of Shane, because it might diminish his father in the boy's eyes. But I think she's also warning herself. And there's a brilliant little gesture that when she says this, she just very quickly turns out the lamp so that the boy can't see that she might actually be blushing when she says it. And there's just a slight self-consciousness as well in Jean Arthur's voice. And there are a lot of moments like that in the film, just little changes that are made that particularly sharpen the relationship between Shane and Joe Starrett's wife. There's a scene in the film, for example, when Shane is teaching little Joey how to shoot.
Gosh almighty, that is good!
And Alan Ladd is very good at this moment because his face is sort of set as if just the action has triggered something in him about his past that he'd rather not see. His face gets very tight-lipped at moments like this. In the novel, that's just between Shane and the boy, and Shane does this little homily where he says, a gun is a tool, it's just like an axe or a shovel. In the film, however, Marion has seen this, and that particular speech of Shane is in response to her comment that I don't want guns to be part of my boy's life. And he does this justification, remember that. But Marion has the last word. She says we'd all be better off in the valley if there were no guns in the valley, and adding, including yours. When Kenneth Tynan was in Hollywood in 1954, one of the people he interviewed was Mae Marsh, the star of D.W. Griffith's Intolerance. And he asked her, do you think there's anybody of Griffith's stature in the industry now? And her reply was, did you see Shane? And she went on to say, I actually sent a fan letter to Stevens because of that film. He said, I just recognised that same kind of pioneer feeling. And I think one of the things actually that's interesting about Shane, as I say, its critical reputation has certainly wobbled since it first came out. But a lot of directors really rate it. I say Woody Allen thinks it's an absolutely wonderful piece of work. He's seen it about 20 times apparently. He said he sometimes shows it to people who don't like westerns. And he said, I don't particularly like westerns, but there are certain ones I do like. I like Oxbow Incident. I like High Noon. He said, but what Shane has got that those films haven't got is a kind of poetry. And I think this is one of the things that marks out Shane, actually, that it is a kind of folk art. There are moments in the film where it does seem to go to another level, go to a poetic level. I'm thinking particularly the funeral scene, where there's so much detail going on in that. The lowering of the coffin, the man playing this slow tribute on his harmonica, the dog pawing at the coffin, Joey wandering off and playing with the horses and the children. What do children do at funerals and things like that? This is what I meant before about when Stevens uses a lot of film, but there's a lot of things going on in his films. He does cover them from every angle, but that's because a lot of the incidental detail is almost as important as what the scene seems to be centrally about.